Hello and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first of 3 workshop sessions that are part of our 2022 Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center Summit. Our summit began with 2 plenary sessions last Thursday. The first featured an overview of the Budget and Policy Center's in-depth analysis of Governor Wolf's budget proposal for 2022-2023. And it was followed by an inspiring keynote speech from State Senator Vincent Hughes talking about the theme of this year's summit, which is advancing democracy for Pennsylvania's future. So we are delighted that you have joined us for this panel about education funding in Pennsylvania. We are going to focus on racial disparities in educational opportunities for students. We'll follow that up with an update on Pennsylvania's school funding lawsuit. The trial just ended. And then we will be happy to answer questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We're happy to answer them. And you're in for a treat. We have David Lapp, who is here from Research for Action, and Tania Scipio-Smith, who is here from an advocacy organization called Children First. And they're going to talk to you. So first, I'm going to turn it over to David Lapp to talk to you about a report that they have been working on. So David, it's all yours.
Good afternoon. Hope everybody can hear me okay. Good to be with you. My name is David Lapp. I'm the Director of Policy Research at Research for Action. We're an education research organization. We've been around for 30 years. We're headquartered in Philadelphia, but we've been doing work all across the country on various issues around public education, all the way from early childhood, pre-K, out of school time, K-12 work, and higher education work. Most of the work that I've been working on has been around state policy in Pennsylvania, and I've been working on issues related to school funding for several years. I'd like to share with you today some work that we did a few years ago called the Educational Opportunity Dashboard. So I'm going to pull up my presentation and we'll walk you through that. Interesting. Not seeing the screen that I was hoping to share. Give me a minute here. Okay, found it. Sorry about that. All right, so hopefully you see this slideshow. All right, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some data we've been discussing and making use of at Research for Action, called the website that we've created called the Educational Opportunity Dashboard. Invite you to check this out. I'll give you the link to this in a little bit, but I'm going to walk you through a little bit. First, just going to start off with sort of the notion that inequity is really the defining feature of public education in Pennsylvania. We see that, and what I mean by that is that we see in Pennsylvania that relative to other states, we spend somewhat more than on average. We have, on average, somewhat higher achievement rates, and we have, on average, somewhat higher access to educational opportunity. But what we see within that average is that there's huge disparities between student subgroups, disparities by poverty, and more remarkably, disparities by race and ethnicity. So we see that in funding, right? There's a report from the Education Law Center in New Jersey that grades Pennsylvania with an A when it comes to overall effort and funding level, but gives Pennsylvania an F when it comes to how well we distribute that funding, how equitably we distribute that. We see that same phenomenon happen with achievement gaps. Pennsylvania is among the top in the country, in the top 10 or so with regard to overall achievement gap. And I know this is very difficult to see, but there's a study from the Stanford's Center for Education Policy Analysis. They've created a thing called the Educational Opportunity Monitoring Project. And they've basically taken test scores from across the country and controlled for things like poverty, and tried to create a uniform comparison across the country in what we see around student achievement. And so here we have Pennsylvania looking at the grade 8 black-white achievement gap being the second highest state in the size of the gap between white students and black students in 8th grade math, and with only Wisconsin and the District of Columbia as higher gaps than Pennsylvania. And invite you again, there's a link to that below where you can see that thing. But so we know that between funding and achievement is a lot. And what we know that funding purchases is opportunity. It funds types of educational opportunities for students. And so we, in 2020, did a study to look at how Pennsylvania's access to opportunity compares to other states. And so we see, and just the real punchline here is that
David, sorry.
Yes.
Hi, this is Adrian. I'm so sorry. It looks like your PowerPoint is in presenter mode. So the screen for us is a little bit smaller and it's harder to see the data. I don't know if there's a slideshow mode that would make it a little bit bigger. Sorry, I hated to interrupt you.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Numbers and
for sure. Thank you for telling me.
I think that's under display settings at the top.
Here I have the this. Okay, slideshow. You say from beginning, but now you're still seeing.
Do you see at the top where it says display settings? It looks like that's a drop down.
Are you talking on PowerPoint or on Zoom?
On PowerPoint, on the screen that you're sharing. I see at the top there's show taskbar, display settings, and end slideshow. I'm wondering if under display settings there's like a drop down there.
Feeling very dense here. I'm sorry. Under slideshow, custom. No. Talk me through that again.
You know what? Hold on one sec. Yes. So the screen that you're sharing where it says unequal access to educational opportunity in the purple, if you right above that, I see something that says display settings, and then it's got like a little upside down triangle next to it.
I do this. That's
beautiful. That's perfect.
Okay.
That's it.
All right. Sorry about that.
Thank you so much. Sorry, everybody, y'all.
No worries. No worries. All right. So again, funding gaps, achievement gaps. I realize these were very tiny to see for you. So forgive me, and I'll be happy to make all this available afterward and the links to these things. So in our dashboard, we wanted to look at gaps and opportunity. And what we see is that on average, and the metrics that we looked at that I'll walk you through momentarily, Pennsylvania has, depending on whether we're looking at the gap between Black and white students, and depending on whether we're looking at all students of color, or the gap between students in poverty or students that are not in poverty, Pennsylvania consistently is among the top in the country. And here we see that they rank 47th out of 50 states in between the Black-white achievement gap, opportunity gap. So let me back up, and we'll come back to that in a second, but let's talk about what we're talking about. So what is this dashboard? It's a web-based tool where we're trying to compare disparities in access to opportunity between the 50 states. And we're using indicators from the federal civil rights data collection. The federal civil rights data collection is the thing that's really remarkable about this, is that it's consistent data. It's available for every school in every state across the country. And so it allows for equal comparison, fair apples and oranges comparisons in this. And so we have 14 indicators that we're using from that CRDC, and we've compiled them into 3 domains that I'll walk you through. We're talking about whether students have access to quality educators, whether students have access to a college and career curriculum, and whether students have access to a positive school climate. So I'll take you through here what we're talking about. First, what do we mean by access? So this is what I mean by this is I'm talking about the most basic, simple form of opportunity. We're talking about whether students, we presume in our study, have access to an opportunity if they merely attend a school that provides that opportunity. So in other words, we're not even saying that they're receiving those things. We're not even asking whether or not they're in the AP course or they're in the classroom with a low student-teacher ratio. We're merely asking, do they even get to attend a school that offers those things? Because we know that whether they get to attend a school that offers those things is really a function of policy. It's a function of what policymakers have created and allowed for students to do. So that's the baseline of what we're looking at here. It's the very first foot in the door to opportunity, so to speak. So let's look at these indicators that we're looking at. Again, these three indices that we created around access to quality educators, positive school climate, and college career ready. With regard to educators, we're saying, do you attend a school that has 100% certified teachers? Do you attend a school that has STEM certified teachers? Do you attend a school that has teachers whose experience level is above or below the national average? Do you attend a school that has above or below the national teacher-student ratio? Do you attend a school that has above or below the average student-counselor ratio? So that's the Quality Educators Index. And that's what's available in the CRDC. With regard to school climate, we're looking at, do you attend a school with a low suspension rate, a low chronic absenteeism rate for students, a low teacher chronic absenteeism rate, and a low grade retention rate in the school? Not again, are you as a student or student subgroup being suspended at high or low rates, but rather, do you even get to attend a school where that is a low rate to begin with, because we know that that is a sign of a quality school climate. And then again, with regard to college and career readiness curriculum, do you attend a school that offers advanced math? Do you attend a school that offers any AP courses? Does it offer calculus, chemistry, or physics? So these are the indicators that we're using to measure access to opportunity amongst schools all across the country, and then to rank states. So dashboard is available here, and if you open it up, it'll take you to a map, a landing page that looks like this, and allows you to click down below on whether you want to look at the overall average of access to indicator, or where you can click on an individual indice, and then you can also rank states. But I'm going to just take you through of some of the bottom line findings here, and then we can spend a little time, if we have it, going through the dashboard itself. So we found in our report that we did specific to Pennsylvania is that while troubling race and disparities in access to educational opportunity exist in almost every state, the size and pervasiveness of Pennsylvania's gaps are among the most severe in the country. And again, there's a full report that we did to summarize the findings from that study that's available on our website. So specific to Pennsylvania, we said that Pennsylvania, again, just like with funding, just like with overall achievement, we rank above average on overall student access to opportunities. But we see that the disparities by race and ethnicity and by student family income are stark. White students in Pennsylvania have higher access to educational opportunity compared to white students in most other states. In contrast, Black and Hispanic students in Pennsylvania have lower access to educational opportunity than do their Black and Hispanic peers in most other states. Just wrestle with that for a minute to think about what that means. That means in our schools, we as Pennsylvanians, our policymakers, are providing schools that are, in general, better than what white students have in most other states. But for Black and Hispanic students, we're providing schools that are worse than what they have in most other states. In all, Pennsylvania's gaps, again, rank among the 5 worst, both in terms of race and poverty, no matter how you sort of slice this. So here we see, digging into the dashboard again, we see that overall, for all students, 64% of Pennsylvania students have access to opportunity as measured by our metrics. And that ranks 15th out of the country. And we see that for white students, that ranks 11th. For Asian students, it ranks 13th. And for students that are not receiving free reduced price lunch, that's what FRPL stands for there, that they also rank 9th in the country in overall access to opportunity. But for students that do receive free or reduced price lunch, they only rank 23rd. And for Black and Hispanic students, they rank respectively 30th and 28th in the country in access to educational opportunity. So again, we can rank this looking at the three main gaps: the gap between Black students and white students, Hispanic students and white students, and students receiving free reduced price lunch versus students that are not receiving free reduced price lunch. And so just ranking the states here again, in our report, we saw Pennsylvania here ranks 47th out of 50 with regard to the Black-white gap, ranks 47th out of 50 with regard to the Hispanic-white gap, and beneath there you see a percentage. That percentage is the percent difference between whether white students have access, what percent of white students have access to these opportunities versus what percent of Black students have access to these opportunities, or Hispanic students in the latter column. And with regard to free reduced price lunch, Pennsylvania ranks 46th in the nation in the gap by that. So one natural question that a lot of people ask is, are the race disparities merely just a proxy or a result of the disparities by poverty? So what we did is we looked at schools that are just high poverty or low poverty or medium poverty in Pennsylvania. And we see that the answer is no. Even with within the subsets of high and mid poverty schools, there are large race disparities in Pennsylvania. So for example, in low poverty schools, there's not much of a gap. Pennsylvania ranks 12th out of 50 states. There's almost zero gap between Black students and white students that are only in low poverty schools. But in mid poverty schools, Pennsylvania ranks 44th out of 50. And in high poverty schools, Pennsylvania ranks as the 42nd out of 44 states. Only there's 6 states that didn't have high enough numbers of high poverty schools to fit into this analysis. But Pennsylvania again ranks high in those regards. So even in the mid and high poverty schools, white students are in those schools and Black students are in those schools have different access to educational opportunity. So our conclusion with this is that even amidst persistent national inequity among race and income groups, the degree of inequity that exists in Pennsylvania in access to education opportunity stands among the worst in the nation. Few states provide so much to their white students and yet so little to their Black and Hispanic students. Few states provide so much less to their poor students compared to their non-poor students. And again, this is again very consistent with what we see with the way Pennsylvania funds schools. And ultimately, it's very consistent with what we see in what our students' outcomes are with regard to achievement tests. So I can stop there. I've probably already gone longer than my time. If there's time, I'd be happy to walk through the dashboard through the website, but I think I'll stop there. And I don't know if we're taking questions now or if we're going to collectively take questions at the end. Either way, it's fine.
So I think we should probably collectively take questions at the end, if that's all right. And so thank you, David. Every time I see this, every time I read this, I want to figure out a way to have this information get more exposure, because it is very jarring, and I think it's something that a lot of people don't understand. So we really appreciate this work that you do, and I think the way that you boiled it down makes it very accessible. So we need to spread the word about this report. So you will send out, I'm assuming you'll send out your slides and a link to the report for people afterwards, so they can dig around in it even deeper. So we've had like a 30,000-foot view of what this looks like in Pennsylvania, and so now we're going to go to Tamia Scipio-Smith, who has taken a much deeper dive into this in school districts in southeastern Pennsylvania, and so she is going to present her findings right now to us. So thanks, Tamia.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, David. Again, I'm Tamia Scipio-Smith. I'm the Education Policy Director at Children First. And what I can say about the data that you're going to see in this report is that it's more localized than what David presented. It's specific to southeastern Pennsylvania. It is, shocking and really, well, I'll just go to the report. It's really hard to see this data, to understand we're in 2022, and this is what we're seeing. So in any sense, this is based upon a report that I wrote last year called No More Dreams Deferred, Building an Education System that Works for Black and Hispanic Students. And it's focused on the suburban school districts just outside of Philadelphia. So Bucks, Chester, Montgomery, and Delaware counties. All right. Okay. So again, this is a 2021 report, and it is kind of what you heard at David's dashboard, but again, specific to the school districts that are here. There are about 60 school districts that are in this particular region that are counted as suburban school districts. And in those school districts, while you may think that it is diverse and it has gotten more diverse over the course of years, I think most people don't realize that at this point, nearly 1 in 4 students who go to school here, and this is traditional public schools and charter schools, this is public schools overall, comprise about almost 85,000 students. So we're not talking about just a few students, we're talking about quite a few students who are experiencing what you're about to see. So what we noticed is that, the relative share of students is fairly small in many school districts. But unfortunately, when it comes to students who are experiencing school climate challenges, Black students experience school very differently than many students do. So specifically, what was astounding about this piece of data is that we looked at the share of Black students enrolled in school districts across the region compared to the share of suspension of students that were, actually suspended. And what we saw was in every county, compared to the share of students that were enrolled, the share of suspensions was significantly higher, 3.5 times higher than what you would expect. And again, school climate is your experience and how the school is working internally for you. A big component of that is really disciplinary policies. How are those impacting you? And again, it wasn't one school district, it wasn't 2 school districts, it wasn't 1 county. Very consistently, it was, horrific differences and disparities. So in some school districts, it was 10 times higher than what you would expect, given the share of students of color, specifically Black students in that school district. Very consistent, very eye-opening. Wasn't just suspensions. So we looked at law enforcement also. And again, what we saw was compared to the share of Black students in any particular school district, when law enforcement was utilized for disciplinary proceedings or procedures or policy implementation, it was more than 2.5 times what you would expect given the share of students enrolled in that particular district. So those are just, disciplinary proceedings are just one component, or disciplinary practices are one component of what you think about when you're talking about an experience a student has when they go to school. There are others, right? And David spoke about some of them. So when we looked at, again, at a county by county level and school district by school district level, what we saw is what he said, at the state level, that when we're looking at the share of, white students in AP classes compared to Black and Hispanic students, the share is different, right? You see that in 92% of the school districts, actually, Black students and Hispanic students were under-enrolled, given their relative share of children who are in a district compared to how many students were actually enrolled in AP classes. Clearly, AP classes aren't the only way that you would determine whether or not students have access to rigorous courses, but it was shocking to see, again, white students typically tended to be overrepresented in those classes. Black and Hispanic students tended to be underrepresented in those classes, again, in 92% of those school districts. And it wasn't just AP classes and student disciplinary issues. When we were looking at, even within school districts, how school districts themselves tended to be segregated, what we saw was in 10 school districts, there was actually a 30-point differential in terms of percentages of students of color that happened to be enrolled in a school. So in a district, you could have one school that was primarily or a majority minority school, but then another school that was in that district where there were hardly any students of color, or a much smaller share of students of color, which, when you think about how neighborhoods differ within a school district, you can see this play out. And what that meant is, even if students tend to be in school districts that are considered to be diverse, many Black and Hispanic students find themselves to be in majority minority schools for whatever reason. And so segregation also plays a role in access to supports and services for students. And of course, and hopefully most of you have followed, or all of you followed, the fair funding lawsuit. Well, here's what else is true. When you're looking at these specific school districts in this particular region, we saw that school districts that had the most Black and Hispanic students had the least to spend on instruction per students. And it was, again, pretty eye-opening to look at it. When you have this district that is, more than 50% Black or Hispanic compared to the district that's less than 10% Black and Hispanic, you see this differential of, $1,500 or so. And again, this is just these particular school districts. Now that may sound like not a big amount, that's a different per students. But when you talk about a classroom, if you're talking 30 kids in a class, that's tens of thousands of dollars. If you're talking about a building, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars. If you're talking about a district, that's millions of dollars, where there's no funding to provide the resources that students need, which of course has a detrimental impact on students long-term. And so then it should be unsurprising, with all of these factors contributing to school climate problems and differentials and funding and gaps, that just tend to be looming, but not only that, widening over time, that we see these achievement gaps. And so again, very consistently across the board, what we saw was that there are these gaps in terms of reading between Black and white students and white and Hispanic students. And unfortunately, it was very, very consistent. It was like, when you see the last two districts that are on this slide, New Hope, Salisbury, and Palisades, it's not that there was no gap. It was that in those particular school districts, there were not enough students in the subset sample size to disaggregate the data and show, how many students were there. So you see that there are Hispanic students represented in this particular chart, but not a Black-white gap. That does not mean that there was no gap. It means that it wasn't enough students to disaggregate the data to provide the information. And so again, what we saw, and kind of building upon what David said, was that it kind of didn't matter, like whether or not the districts were well-funded or not. These gaps were persistent, and they existed kind of across the board for students. Some, of course, in the well-funded districts, the gaps may be slightly smaller, but they existed. And that's not just in Bucks County. When you look at Montgomery County, there is no district where there wasn't a gap for students. This was, pretty, again, eye-opening with the data that was, again, I should say pre-pandemic, but still, this was the most recent and available data, and we just saw these gaps. And it existed in Chester County, again, across the board. And finally, it existed in Delaware County. And so, if I showed you what the charts looked like in math, it would also be similar. And I told you this data was from the last and most recent, time before the pandemic, 2018, 2019. But we look back as far as 2012, and what we saw was, unfortunately, the same bit of consistency. So then it begs the question, if all of these things are going on, what are the policies that we can do to implement this change, assuming that collectively people want to see the change? By my own personal experience is that I'm a mother of 2 children who happen to be in one of these school districts. So when I did this report, it was really, really difficult for me to see all of this information in all of these places. And I have access to it. So what about the parents who don't know or who don't have access to this information, or just simply don't, understand why it is that their students are struggling? Well, collectively, we have a problem. And historically, we haven't chosen to look at it as something that requires a comprehensive and collective set of policy changes in order to modify the problems that students are facing. So the proposed policy changes are these. The first, create an accountability system at the state level that measures progress on equity. So it sounds pretty simple, but there should actually be a requirement for school districts to conduct equity audits. Because when this report was being drafted and written, and requests were made to different school districts to find out where they were and how they were doing and what they've implemented, a lot of them were at the very, very beginning of considering whether this data was even something that was, helpful to them moving forward. And it seemed as if a lot of them didn't realize these kinds of conditions were actually going on for their students. So it seems, it stands to reason, and it's a pretty simple request to just get an equity audit required every 3 years so that school districts can not only assess where they are in terms of providing policies for their students, but also assessing the progress. Are the things that they're implementing actually having an impact? Is there, you can't prove necessarily causation, but maybe there's a correlation. But the point is, if you don't do anything and you don't measure it, then the gaps that we see will just continue to grow, and students will still be experiencing school in a way that fosters inequity. The next recommendation was to reform school climate policies so that the disproportional racial gaps are closed. It shouldn't be that one particular group of students consistently across the board experiences disciplinary issues that results in them being disparately impacted. That shouldn't be the case. So we've got to figure out why that is the case and how that is the case. But again, if we are not making sure that these policies are not having this disparate impact, we can't change the outcome for these students. And we all know that if you keep getting suspended, or if law enforcement continues to be involved, especially in incidents that your peers don't have that same kind of response, that it leads to more likely, some more severe, more adult disciplinary problems down the road. So instead of having these policies that are directed or lead to like criminalization, we've got to implement policies that address the actual problems students are having. That's where the funding comes in, to provide those counselors, to provide those psychologists, to provide all these resources that we know students could really utilize. The next one, of course, another common sense solution, requires schools to demonstrate equitable access to high quality academic options. We hear time and time again that we want students in this state to be career ready or college ready or next step ready. And a lot of resources go into getting other students to that point. But in reality, it's about skill acquisition. And if we aren't providing those students with rigorous curriculum or rigorous instruction, or instructions by teachers who have experience, or learning in overcrowded classrooms, then we aren't going to get to the point where students have acquired the skills to truly be successful in their next steps. So of course, there should be policies put in place to ensure that these, that tracking isn't a thing, that students who want to have, to have access to these rigorous courses are in fact steered toward these rigorous courses. And students who want to be challenged are actually placed in settings where they're challenged. And students are actually notified that these are options for them. And even more importantly than that, that schools recognize potential and in fact choose to support the students once they're in these classes by providing tutoring and additional resources so that they can stay there. And again, from personal experience, I jumped for joy last week because my son, who coincidentally enough is a 7th grade student, who actually did get straight A's for his first, 9 weeks, finally, for the first time, and I have a daughter who's even older than that, the recommendation was honors courses for him. Now, you wouldn't think it would take this long and this, knowing that you have this good student, but the recommendation for him wasn't that last year. And in fact, even though I would say both of my students are good students, the recommendation was always regular classes. So again, it's a shame that, parents have to fight and do a lot of research and go in and meet with a lot of people to have this recommendation, knowing full well their students are capable of handling a challenge. So we've got to get schools to demonstrate this equitable access to high quality academic options throughout those years, not just at the end or not just at the beginning, but consistently, and offer parents and families and students the support. And finally, increase state funding to adequately and equitably fund schools. Again, I hope you all were following the lawsuit. We know that there's this $4.6 billion shortfall. We know that in many school districts across the state, students are attending schools that just don't have the funding in order to provide long-term access to resources. So one way to close that gap and to start making sure that students of color and students that are poor actually do have access is to increase state funding so that we can begin to at least provide those resources consistently, so we're not having the same conversation 20 years from now. With that, here's my contact information, and I will put a link to the report so you can read it in further detail into the chat box.
Thank you, Tamia. And so, I think this all can seem very heavy and very discouraging, but I guess I would say the research that Tamia has done is truly groundbreaking, and being able to take all this information, and then her organization, Children First, they know superintendents, they know school board members, they know parents, and they really take this information and are helping to raise awareness of the issue that's happening. So I think for a very long time, obviously this has been happening for a very long time, but many people were not aware of it. And so the work that Tamia and Children First are doing is really helping to move the needle in the right direction. And I think, Tamia, you're going to be updating that report this year again too. Is that correct? So this is kind of like a little taste of what is to come. This was not a one-off. Like, you're not done with this work, correct?
We are definitely not done with this work. I'm sure that we will update some of the findings. We do have like another series of reports done about children in the counties overall that's coming out, but definitely we will continue to do this work. And so I very strongly encourage people to visit the Children First website and to sign up for updates and to look at this report and to stay engaged with this issue, especially if you live in the southeastern Pennsylvania region, because they are definitely leaders on this work. So I think before we take questions, I would like to just give everybody a little overview of the school funding lawsuit and drive you to a resource there. And talk about that. And then I think we can kind of talk about questions, because there are a lot of really important and good things happening in Pennsylvania right now to help change a lot of this for children. And you are on
I think it is actually a very lucky time to be in Pennsylvania because we have a lot of opportunities to make change. So right now, we are about a couple weeks out from the school funding lawsuit trial having concluded. So back in 2014, a group of school districts, the Pennsylvania Association of Rural and Small Schools, the Pennsylvania NAACP State Conference, and some parents came together, represented by the Education Law Center and the Public Interest Law Center, and they filed a lawsuit in Pennsylvania. And they basically said the state is violating the Constitution for two reasons. First, there is a clause that says that the state must provide for a thorough and efficient system of public education. The system is not thorough and efficient. And then it also, they also make the claim that the state is violating the Equal Protection Clause because students, based on just simply where they live, the opportunities that they receive in their schools are radically different. And so, so the lawsuit was filed. Very many things happened. It finally went to trial in the fall. They were in the courtroom for about 4 months. And there's a website here that I think if you're interested in the lawsuit, you can find kind of everything that you need to know about the lawsuit here. So you have an overview of it. I would sign up for the email list here too. Real nice, really good information. You will get it. They don't email you a lot, just very kind of important updates. So you can start at the top and you can see, if you go to news and you go down to the news tab, you can see an overview of testimony that happened every single day in the trial. Fascinating, wonderful testimony, horrible things that were said by the defendants, and the defendants were Jake Corman, the leader of the Senate, Brian Cutler, the leader of the House, and then Governor Wolf was kind of a defendant, but they didn't really defend it. And so their lawyers were in the courtroom every day defending the system. Then we also had a lot of superintendents and parents and teachers who were testifying along with education experts. So if you go to the news section, you can see the testimony that everyone gave every single day in a little roundup. The other thing that I think is really important and interesting for people who are kind of maybe new to this whole space is there was an expert who did a study, and he calculated using a benchmark in state law that was used back in 2008 to determine how much does each school district need to spend in order to give students the opportunities that they need to meet state standards. So it was called like an adequacy study. And so he took that and he updated all the data, and he went through and he found out, and it's calculated for every single school district, what is the adequacy gap? Like, how much is your district spending now versus how much does your district need to spend in order to have the resources you need to meet state standards? And so you can go in here and you can find your own school district to see what your own school district's adequacy gap is. If you don't know, you're not a little geography wonk and you can't find your school district, you can go up here and I think a lot of times you have to type in your zip code. It doesn't necessarily work if you type in your school district. So type in your zip code and it will bring up your school district. So I would type in like 17257, that brings up my district. And then you can click on your district and you can see your shortfall. And then it will show you your own school's adequacy gap. And you can download a shareable image. You can go back to the map. And so I think that this is a way of really helping bring to life like what's at stake here and how underfunded different school districts are. And you can see when we look at the map that it is not just it's not just urban districts, it's urban and rural districts and districts all over the state that are really experiencing very, very high shortfalls in their funding. So, so this is a resource that I highly recommend that people visit. I'm gonna stop sharing. So that you can find out more about the lawsuit. So it's fundourschools.pa.org. Where we stand right now, the trial is over. All the testimony has been given that was in the courtroom. And so now, and between now and July, both parties are going to be able to submit findings of fact and conclusions of law and amicus briefs. And then starting in July, the judge will do her deliberation. There's a single judge in Commonwealth Court who will make a decision about whether the system is constitutional or not constitutional. And then, she could take weeks or months. We don't know when that will happen. And then it is very likely that whoever loses will appeal to the Supreme Court. So the court case itself is very important in helping us understand that when we are seeing school budgets right now, like we're looking, and every school district, every school board is starting to figure out how they're going to balance their budget. The real problem we have in Pennsylvania is that we rank 45th in the nation for state funding for K-12 schools. So the state is super cheap, and that means that we're really relying on property taxes. When you're relying on property taxes, school districts that have a lot of local wealth are able to raise a lot of money locally. They can, raise enough money to fund their schools, give their kids what they need. And then school districts that don't have that local wealth, no matter how much they tax themselves, there is just, the wealth isn't there to be raised, and they can't raise the local wealth. So that is like the reason why we have this disparity. As we look at forward to the budget in Harrisburg right now, Governor Wolf has proposed a $1.75 billion increase in state funding for schools. This is not, I should have said it in the beginning, we have a $4.6 billion gap between what we're spending and what we need to spend. So Governor Wolf's $1.7 billion proposal does not solve the problem, but it takes a gigantic step forward, and it really would make a huge difference in driving dollars into the districts that are the least funded. And so when we look back at what David's opportunity dashboard was saying, really we can see that there are just some school districts that just overall lack the resources that they need for students. And these are school districts that educate a very high proportion of students of color in Pennsylvania and a very high proportion of students in poverty. And it's all based on the system of funding, the scheme in Harrisburg that makes school funding and makes the resources in our schools dependent on the local wealth in our communities. So we really have an enormous opportunity right now with the lawsuit and with the spotlight that we've shined on these inequities with COVID, and with people understanding that school districts that didn't have the resources they needed had a much more difficult time transitioning and providing students with what they need. We're starting to see that it's very difficult for many of these students to recover from COVID, and they need extra help. We are at a moment in time in Pennsylvania when advocacy is going to make an enormous difference. We're also in an election year where I think everybody is going to want to be able to take credit for making sure that their schools are funded. So I guess my message to everybody out there is this is the moment when we need to all be standing up for the funding that our school districts need. We really need to be talking to our lawmakers, be spreading the word, and we all need to be between now and June 30th when the budget's passed, we have an opportunity like we have never had before in Pennsylvania, or have not had in decades. And you probably also, if you're paying attention with the Budget and Policy Center in Harrisburg, it's like the legislature is this giant dragon sitting on this huge mountain of money, and they just want to sit there and hoard it. And we need to be the ones that are going to say, you need to spend this money, you need to invest it in our kids. It is time for some education justice in Pennsylvania. And education justice really in Pennsylvania is racial justice, because as you can see, it is students of color who are most shortchanged by the policies in Harrisburg, and we really have an opportunity to help fix that. So I'm going to put my information and contact information in the chat, but right now I wonder, are there any questions that anybody has of David and or Tamia about any of this? Or were they such great presenters that you know everything already and you don't have any questions?
I know there was one question in the chat, Susan. I'm going to pull it and put it right at the bottom, so it's the most current thing in the chat.
Okay. Someone asked, has there been a study or a review of the percentage of students of color by regions in the state?
Sure, I'm completely understanding that.
So we have all of these maps that show opportunity gaps and funding gaps, but I've not seen one that had an overlay of percentage of students of color in either in the districts or even in by region or by IU. And it would inform some of my thinking about further decisions that are being made on the funding side. And I just didn't know if you were aware of a map that had that as an overlay available.
I'm not off the top of my head, but I know there have been those have been out there several places. I can take a look. I think we can find them. They're also, I mean, they're pretty easy to put together. That data is very accessible and frequently published, so it shouldn't be.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's not something that I've seen yet. And it's something that we spend a great deal of time talking about funding and talking about equity. And I think that maybe having an overlay would be something for me to look at. Thank you.
And so, you know, you're also, everyone here is hooked in with the Budget and Policy Center, and they do great work on education funding also. And so as we move through budget season, you're gonna have a lot of advocacy opportunities to, you know, so that you can engage with the whole passing the budget and the education funding part of it. So you are in very good hands with the Budget and Policy Center. Are there any other questions that anyone has for us today? Okay, well, if there aren't any, I think I'm just going to close out here and just say the 2022 Budget Summit continues with the second workshop next Thursday afternoon on March 31st from 1 o'clock until 2:15 again. Just like today's workshop, we'll be offering 2 workshops at the same time. One of the workshops is entitled Addressing Housing Affordability in the COVID-19 Period and Beyond, an overview on curbing evictions in Pennsylvania, emergency rental assistance and possible solutions. This workshop will be a discussion of current events to assist renters during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, including eviction diversion programs and the emergency rental assistance program. It will include the impact this issue can have on Pennsylvanians and possibly short and long-term solutions. And the other workshop is called The Future of Pennsylvania's Democracy. Democracy continues to be a high-profile topic, whether it's redistricting, elections, or voting policy. There have been a number of aggressive proposals to change who holds the power, including proposals to give the Pennsylvania legislature the power to overrule voters, and multiple proposals to change the Pennsylvania Constitution. By the way, there is a proposal to change the Pennsylvania Constitution to take all of Pennsylvania's state funding and give it directly to parents. So there are actually lawmakers in Harrisburg who support cutting 100% of Pennsylvania's school funding from the state and depositing it directly into the pockets of parents. So that is one that we all need to look out for. So they do have a new, you know, the legislature has a tactic of legislating by constitutional amendment to circumvent the governor's constitutional responsibility to sign or veto legislation. So you can learn more about what the legislature is up to and what makes sense for Pennsylvania's future. And you can find more information about these on the Budget Summit's webpage. And the link will be in the chat. So, and then the third and final workshop will take place 2 weeks from today, followed by a closing plenary session. That will be a panel discussion from 5 progressive champions in the State House of Representatives. So again, you can go to the Budget Summit webpage to find more information. So thank you for joining us. Many thanks to David and Tamia, who are just incredibly busy. Thank you for sharing this information with us. Thank you to the Budget and Policy Center for organizing this and giving us this opportunity. And so I think everyone looks forward to seeing you on Zoom next week on Thursday to continue the Budget and Policy Summit. So thank you.